Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection. Again, the whole goal of this is try to help you do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. And so, what I want to talk about today, continuing with the research series, seems like I keep diving deeper into different topics, but I think they're valid. I think they're worthwhile. Some of the comments that have come in, I appreciate comments you've made. So I'm just kind of continuing with this vein, and we'll just kind of take it a step at a time here with these little snippets. So today what I want to do is talk about types of dissertations. Again, this is, again, it may be Purdue-centric, but I at least want to present at least the two major types of dissertations that I've seen across our institution. And again, dissertation is basically the kind of the conclusionary project or product of a doctoral work, particularly PhD. But there are other kinds of professional doctorates. Some professional doctorates might have a dissertation. But it's most common with PhD. And so I want to talk about the two main types of dissertations that I see with PhDs. And so the first type that I would describe is, and again, these are words that I use to describe them, but essentially the first type would be a monolithic or a traditional dissertation. And essentially the chapters, I mean, you have an introductory, chapter 1 is an introduction, chapter 2 is literature review, chapter 3 is a methodology, chapter 4 is data, chapter 5 is summary and conclusions, and essentially you wrap all that together with some appendices and maybe plus or minus a couple chapters, and you have the dissertation. And a significant thing to note is that in the conventional approach here, the traditional monolithic, not conventional, I used the wrong word, in the traditional monolithic dissertation, the dissertation is actually considered the product, and then you would publish articles in conferences, journals, that kind of thing afterwards. And so that's kind of, and the other thing that I would say about the monolithic dissertation is it's typically surrounding a specific set of research questions that are all defined at the outset, right? Like totally collective. I mean, they're all together. Usually it's one or two major questions, and then some sub-questions. So that's kind of the monolithic traditional. The other type of dissertation is what I would call an article-based or a conventional. I call it conventional, but there are some fields that have been doing article-based dissertations for a long time. But the article-based dissertation is where chapters 2 through N, and the number of chapters may vary. 3 is common, but it may be more. But chapters 2 through N are articles that you've already published, typically as journal articles. And the hypotheses or the research that's being done in those papers is loosely connected, or it may be directly connected, I suppose. But the main point is that these articles have been published, and then they basically become chapters within that. And then essentially to finish out the dissertation, you create a chapter on the front end, says how it's all related. Create a chapter on the back end that says where it's all going. And it kind of, usually when I describe it, is it kind of functions like a 5-year research lab report, like if you were in industry doing research, as opposed to the monolithic dissertation is more like what academics are oftentimes used to. And so the other thing that I would say about the article-based dissertation is that the dissertation is a byproduct. In the other one, we were talking about the articles being a byproduct. Here, we're talking about the dissertation being a byproduct because the chapters have already been published. So you have these two major kinds of dissertations that exist, and the key is to kind of find out, I assume, if you're in a PhD program, you kind of know what's the standard or what's the culture of that unit and kind of what's normal. But I want to dive into this just a little bit more to just put some constraints around it or some thoughts around it, at least based on my experience. So if we go back to the monolithic or traditional, I listed kind of all the chapters. And so I want to kind of give you some sense of, size, if you will. But, chapter 1, which is the introduction, it basically sets up the research, gives you a quick overview. And I intend on, in later videos, actually diving into each of these sections to kind of talk about it more. I'm most familiar with the conventional, I keep calling it conventional, the monolithic or traditional dissertation, because that's historically what my college and school had done. Now they're starting to take a foray into the article-based dissertation, but chapter 1 is typically an introduction, and it's usually about 10 pages, plus or minus, right? Chapter 2 is the literature review, or some people call it a prior work section, but essentially the literature review, the whole goal of it is to basically, you're building a legal case for the research questions that you're asking, And then you're also building a legal case for why you're approaching the methodology the way you are. Now, the literature review is not intended to be like the Bible or the Quran or the whatever, the holy book of that entire topic, although I have seen some dissertations, even my own, I kind of approached it that way, but it was purposeful. Usually the literature review is only kind of the, the most seminal or most germane, the things that are most important to point out why you are asking the question. And usually what you're doing is you're identifying a gap, or you're identifying something that you want to replicate or something like that, right? But that's chapter 2. And chapter 2 can range from 20 pages to 30, 40, 50, right? So this is definitely an area to talk with your major professor about as far as what the expectation is, because they can also put other expectations. Like some faculty will say, I only want you to reference things in the last 5 or 10 years or whatever it is. So talk to your major professor, make sure they don't have certain expectations if you're doing this monolithic or traditional dissertation. Chapter 3 is a methodology, and that chapter is going to talk about the method by which, if you're using quantitative methods, you're going to set up, how are you doing sampling, what statistical methods are you using, if it's a things and stuff kind of research project, what's the apparatus, what's the setup, how are you going to test it, the conditions under which you're going to test, and most importantly with the things and stuff, what is the measure for success, right? Because when you do quantitative research, you're typically saying, okay, I'm looking for, I'm going to set my P or my alpha at this and blah, blah, blah. Well, in things and stuff, you have to say, okay, what's the expectation? What's the measure for success? What mark are you trying to hit? And you want to set that out before you actually, you want to lay that out before you actually get started, because, if you find a result and then after the fact say, oh, I meant to do that, it's questionable as far as research is concerned. But the methodology, usually it's like 10 to 15 pages. If you're doing a multi-methods or a mixed methods type of study, there are situations where it can get longer, but that's the general. Chapter 4 is usually data. Usually it's 15 pages. But again, if you're doing quantitative research, it's going to be on the lower end. If you're doing qualitative research where everything's about the narrative and text that you're writing, that's going to be on the high end, right? And it can be all the way up to 50 pages because you've got text in there. And then chapter 5 is usually summary conclusions and the future. And the problem with it is usually when people get to that last chapter, even though it's probably the most important chapter, like, what did you learn? What's the summary? What's the conclusion? What's the impact? What's it mean to the world? Oftentimes you get tired of writing. And so sometimes it's really hard to get people to really flesh out that chapter as fully as it should be, because that's really where, that's like the punchline of the joke, if you will. So, and then you also have appendices in there, right? So that's kind of the monolithic. Now, I'll also say, like at Purdue, we have a specific format. It's pretty generic, but we have a specific format for that document, and we have tools that can kind of help you build that. We have a tool called Overleaf, which is a LaTeX-based editor that's a lot easier than old school LaTeX. We have a tool called Authenticate that helps you detect plagiarism and those kinds of things. So whether you're at Purdue or somewhere else, you're probably going to want to figure out what kinds of tools and resources are available for you. Now, if we talk about the article or conventional dissertation, I'm less familiar with it, but I've been around it enough to be able to point out the things that I think are important to note. First of all, is just getting a handle on what's the expectation for the number of articles that are going to be part of that dissertation, right? So that's usually a pretty easy thing to figure out. A couple of the more difficult things would be, what happens if you co-author an article? Can you include that in your article-based dissertation? And how do you acknowledge or separate what you did versus what the other person or other people did? Most units have a way for, documenting that. And so you want to figure out, exactly what that is. Copyright issues can be an issue, right? So whenever you publish, we're still in this transition from what I would say old school publishing, where when we put together conferences and journals, the publishers try to take all the rights from them, and then they turn around, they create collections, and they sell them back to institutions, to what we have today, which is kind of an open publishing movement, where faculty and institutions try to retain certain parts of the copyright. Again, copyright is it's not just one thing, it's 5 things. It's right of first publication, right of duplication, right of distribution, derivative rights, and public performance and display rights. And so when we talk about publishing, the key thing if you're doing an article-based dissertation is making sure that you retain derivative rights and public performance and display rights, so that you don't have to ask permission to include that article in your dissertation. Now it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that's essentially how old school publishing was set up. You basically gave away all rights to be able to get your stuff accepted, and then they turn around and sell it back to you because you give away all the rights and you have to ask if you want to use it for stuff. So understand that copyrights are a big thing, and Purdue has a specific mechanism by which you can actually make sure you keep track of that. You can contact me separately if you have questions on that. If you're at another institution, you're going to want to figure that out. The biggest thing you want to look for is when you're publishing, if where you're publishing uses the Creative Commons licensing, you're probably good to go, right? You're probably not going to be surrendering. You may not be surrendering any rights. Now, logically, you have to give away the right of first publication, but you're not permanently giving away rights as in the old school days. And then the last thing that I would say with a conventional article-based dissertation is kind of, what are the expectations for the format of the document? Some disciplines, you can actually just take the article as formatted in the journal or the conference and just slap it right into the dissertation and call it done. Others, you'll actually have to reformat it, and they may actually have specific ways in which you have to reference where it was originally published and all those kinds of things. So kind of do your homework here if you're doing the article-based dissertation, so that you make sure that you kind of get all your P's and Q's lined up just so. Because the dissertation and a thesis, and for master's degrees, these are really important because they pretty much follow all of your academic career. And so you want to kind of try to make them as perfect as anything. I guess some last thoughts about, regardless of the type of dissertation, is understanding what's the acceptable amount of overlap that can exist between a master's degree and a PhD. Because a lot of times, if you get a master's degree, you may continue that work, and if you do, you want to know how much duplicity is acceptable. And what I mean by duplicity is, getting credit twice for doing something once. In various fields, there's different takes on how much duplicity. Sometimes you would call it self-plagiarism, but how much duplicity is allowed. Oftentimes, when you go from a master's to a PhD continuing the same idea, I would say oftentimes it's okay that the idea may be duplicitous. The key is that you're extending it in some way. You're doing something more than you did. But usually there's a resistance to a lot of duplicity relative to the text or the narrative that would be in the final dissertation. So figure that out. Have a conversation with your major professor, and make sure you kind of know what the expectations there are. And then the other part that I would say is understanding that most institutions provide a mechanism for you to do what's called, at least at Purdue, it's called an embargo, where once you're done with your degree, you can withhold the dissertation from being published or being released. I shouldn't say published, because most of the time when institutions like Purdue put your dissertation or your thesis in their mechanism for distribution. At Purdue, we use an internal tool. Some other institutions have internal tools. Some might use a service like ProQuest. Nevertheless, wherever they put it, that's not really considered publishing, but there are times where you may want to not have that be released in those mechanisms till you've had an opportunity to publish, particularly if you're talking about the monolithic dissertation. So know that. Know that institutions oftentimes provide mechanisms for confidentiality if you're working on things that you need to restrict in some way, whether it be because of it being involved with a federal grant or a contract or whatever. Most of those things are available. So I think that wraps it up. It's kind of a discussion about two different types of PhDs. I'll say that there's also some innovative thinking in some fields about getting away from the traditional dissertation and doing something totally different. Like, let's say maybe you're doing research in movie making. Maybe it's a movie that is actually the output of your degree. So just realize there's a lot of different thinking on this, but these are the two types that I see at Purdue. If you're at another institution, check and see what the expectations are there. So hope you find this useful. Drop me a line if you have any questions. If I can be of any help, just give me a shout. So have a great day. Thanks.